Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Chapters Live. As always, I am Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous squid hat because we are diving back into the underwater world of Jules Verne's adventure novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, to recap what we read off last time, 2 weeks ago, the world was astounded by reports of a mysterious large creature seen throughout the various seas that no one could particularly identify. Now, everyone sort of bounced back and forth as to what they thought it was, and what ended up happening is our protagonist, Dr. Aronnax, ended up throwing himself into the spotlight and into the fray by going through all the evidence and insisting that it was a large narwhal. Now, he ended up, as a result, finding himself aboard the Abraham Lincoln, which was a ship whose job was to go out and basically pursue the so called narwhal. That's where he ended up with his manservant Conseil and where he met the famous harpooner Ned Land. Now, when we last left off, they had sighted the so called narwhal but could not catch it. And in a tragic turn of events, Professor Aronnax and also Conseil were both thrown overboard. And after what seemed like certain doom, they found themselves, strangely enough, riding on the back of the narwhal with Ned Land. And they quickly discovered that the narwhal was not a whale at all. It was, in fact, a submarine of some kind made out of metal. And when the submarine was about to dive, they knocked furiously on the hatch, which was opened, and they were snatched inside by mysterious men. And that is exactly where we will pick up in this moment of shock from our three heroes. And we will pick up with Chapter 8, Mobilis in Mobili. This brutally executed capture was carried out with lightning speed. My companions and I had no time to collect ourselves. I don't know how they felt about being shoved inside this aquatic prison, but as for me, I was shivering all over. With whom were we dealing? Surely with some new breed of pirates exploiting the sea after their own fashion. The narrow hatch had barely closed over me when I was surrounded by profound darkness. Saturated with the outside light, my eyes couldn't make out a thing. I felt my naked feet clinging to the steps of an iron ladder. Forcibly seized, Ned Land and Conseil were behind me. At the foot of the ladder, a door opened and instantly closed behind us with a loud clang. We were alone. Where? I couldn't say, could barely even imagine. All was darkness, but such utter darkness that after several minutes my eyes were still unable to catch a single one of those hazy gleams that drifted through even the blackest nights. Meanwhile, furious at these goings-on, Ned Land gave free rein to his indignation. "Damnation!" he exclaimed. "These people are about as hospitable as the savages of New Caledonia. All that's lacking is for them to be cannibals. I wouldn't be surprised if they were, but believe you me, they won't eat me without my kicking up a protest." "Calm yourself, Ned, my friend," Conseil replied serenely. "Don't flare up so quickly. We aren't in a kettle yet." "In a kettle, no," the Canadian shot back, "but in an oven for sure. It's dark enough for one. Luckily, my Bowie knife hasn't left me, and I can still see well enough to put it to use. The first one of these bandits who lays a hand on me—" "Don't be so irritable, Ned," I then told the harpooner, "and don't ruin things for us with pointless violence. Who knows whether they might be listening to us? Instead, let's try to find out where we are." I started moving, groping my way. After 5 steps, I encountered an iron wall made of riveted boilerplate. Then, turning around, I bumped into a wooden table next to which several stools had been set. The floor of this prison lay hidden beneath thick hempen matting that deadened the sound of footsteps. Its naked walls didn't reveal any trace of a door or window. Going around the opposite way, Conseil met up with me, and we returned to the middle of this cabin, which had to be 20 feet long by 10 wide. As for its height, not even Ned Land, with his great stature, was able to determine it. Half an hour had already gone by without our situation changing, when our eyes were suddenly spirited from utter black darkness into blinding light. Our prison lit up all at once. In other words, it filled with luminescent matter so intense that at first I couldn't stand the brightness of it. From its glare and whiteness, I recognized the electric glow that had played around this underwater boat like some magnificent phosphorescent phenomenon. After involuntarily closing my eyes, I reopened them and saw this luminous force came from a frosted half-globe curving out of the cabin ceiling. "Finally, it's light enough to see," Ned Land exclaimed, knife in hand, staying on the defensive. "Yes," I replied, then ventured the opposite view. "But as for our situation, we're still in the dark." "Master must learn patience," said the emotionless Conseil. The sudden illumination of our cabin enabled me to examine its tiniest details. It contained only a table and 5 stools. Its invisible door must have been hermetically sealed. Not a sound reached our ears. Everything seemed dead inside this boat. Was it in motion, or stationary on the surface of the ocean, or sinking into the depths? I couldn't tell. But this luminous globe hadn't been turned on without good reason. Consequently, I hoped that some crewmen would soon make an appearance. If you want to consign people to oblivion, you don't light up their dungeons. I was not mistaken. Unlocking noises became audible, a door opened, and 2 men appeared. One was short and stocky, powerfully muscled, broad shoulders, robust of limbs, a head squat, the hair black and luxuriant, the mustache heavy, the eyes bright and penetrating, and his whole personality stamped with that southern-blooded zest that, in France, typifies the people of Provence. The philosopher Diderot had very aptly claimed that a man's bearing is the clue to his character, and this stocky little man was certainly a living proof of this claim. You could sense that his everyday conversation must have been packed with such vivid figures of speech as personification, symbolism, and misplaced modifiers. But I was never in a position to verify this because around me he used only an odd and utterly incomprehensible dialect. The second stranger deserves more detailed description. A disciple of such character-judging anatomists as Gratelet or Engel could have read this man's features like an open book. Without hesitation, I identified his dominant qualities: self-confidence, since his head reared like a nobleman's above the arc formed by the lines of his shoulders, and his black eyes gazed with icy assurance; calmness, since his skin, pale rather than ruddy, indicated tranquillity of blood; energy, shown by the swiftly knitting muscles of his brow; and finally courage, since his deep breathing denoted tremendous reserves of vitality. I might add that this was a man of great pride, that his calm, firm gaze seemed to reflect thinking on an elevated plane, and that the harmony of his facial expressions and bodily movements resulted in an overall effect of unquestionable candor, according to the findings of physiognomists, those analysts of facial character. I felt involuntarily reassured in his presence, and this boded well for our interview. Whether this individual was 35 or 50 years of age, I could not precisely state. He was tall, his forehead broad, his nose straight, his mouth clearly etched, his teeth magnificent, his hands refined, tapered, and to use a word from palmistry, highly psychic. In other words, worthy of serving a lofty and passionate spirit. This man was certainly the most wonderful physical specimen I had ever encountered. One unusual detail: his eyes were spaced a little far from each other and could instantly take in nearly a quarter of the horizon. This ability, as I later verified, was strengthened by a range of vision even greater than Ned Land's. When the stranger focused his gaze on an object, his eyebrow lines gathered into a frown, his heavy eyelids closed around his pupils to contract his huge field of vision, and he looked. What a look! As if he could magnify objects shrinking into the distance, as if he could probe your very soul, as if he could pierce those sheets of water so opaque to our eyes and scan the deepest seas. Wearing caps made of sea otter fur and shod in sealskin fishing boots, these 2 strangers were dressed in clothing made from some unique fabric that flattered the figure and allowed great freedom of movement. The taller of the 2, apparently the leader on board, examined us with the greatest care but without pronouncing a word. Then, turning to his companion, he conversed with him in a language I didn't recognize. It was a sonorous, harmonious, flexible dialect whose vowels seemed to undergo a highly varied accentuation. The other replied with a shake of the head and added 2 or 3 utterly incomprehensible words. Then he seemed to question me directly with a long stare. I replied in clear French that I wasn't familiar with his language, but he didn't seem to understand me, and the situation grew rather baffling. "Still, master shall tell our story," Conseil said to me. "Perhaps these gentlemen will grasp a few words of it." I tried again, telling the tale of our adventures, clearly articulating my every syllable, and not leaving out a single detail. I stated our names and titles, then in order I introduced Professor Aronnax, his manservant Conseil, and Mr. Ned Land, harpooner. The man with calm, gentle eyes listened to me serenely, even courteously, and paid remarkable attention, but nothing in his facial expression indicated that he understood my story. When I finished, he didn't pronounce a single word. One resource still left was to speak English. Perhaps they would be familiar with this nearly universal language, but I only knew it, as I did the German language, well enough to read it fluently, not well enough to speak it correctly. Here, however, our overriding need was to make ourselves understood. "Come on, it's your turn," I told the harpooner. "Over to you, Mr. Land. Pull out of your bag of trips the best English ever spoken by an Anglo-Saxon, and try for a more favorable result than mine." Ned needed no persuading and started our story all over again, most of which I could follow. Its content was the same, but the form differed. Carried away by his volatile temperament, the Canadian put great animation into it. He complained vehemently about being imprisoned in defiance of his civil rights, asked by virtue of which law he was hereby detained, invoked writs of habeas corpus, threatened to press charges against anyone holding him in illegal custody, ranted, gesticulated, shouted, and finally conveyed by an expressive gesture that we were dying of hunger. This was perfectly true, but we had nearly forgotten the fact. Much to his amazement, the harpooner seemed no more intelligible than I had been. Our visitors didn't bat an eye. Apparently they were engineers who understood the languages of neither the French physicist Arago nor the English physicist Faraday. Thoroughly baffled, after vainly exhausting our philological resources, I no longer knew which tactic to pursue when Conseil told me, "If master will authorize me, I will tell the whole business in German." "What? You know German?" I exclaimed. "Like most Flemish people, with all due respect to master." "On the contrary, my respect is due you. Go to it, my boy." And Conseil, in his serene voice, described for the third time the various vicissitudes of our story. But despite our narrator's fine accent and stylish turns of phrase, the German language met with no success. Finally, as a last resort, I hauled out everything I could remember from my early school days, and I tried to narrate our adventures in Latin. Cicero would have plugged his ears and sent me to the scullery, but somehow I managed to pull through, with the same negative result. This last attempt ultimately misfiring, the two strangers exchanged a few words in their incomprehensible language and withdrew, not even favoring us with one of those encouraging gestures that are used in every country in the world. The door closed again. "This is outrageous!" Ned Land shouted, exploding for the 20th time. "I ask you, we speak French, English, German, and Latin to these rogues, and neither of them has the decency to even answer back." "Calm down, Ned," I told the seething harpooner. "Anger won't get us anywhere." "But, Professor," our irascible companion went on, "can't you see that we could die of hunger in this iron cage?" "Bah," Conseil put in philosophically. "We can hold out a good while yet." My friends," I said, "we mustn't despair. We've gotten out of tighter spots, so please do me the favor of waiting a bit before you form your views on the commander and crew of this boat." "My views are fully formed," Ned Land shot back. "They're rogues." "Oh, good. And from what country?" "Roguedom." My gallant Ned, as yet that country isn't clearly marked on maps of the world, but I admit that the nationality of these two strangers is hard to make out. Neither English, French, nor German, that's all we can say. But I'm tempted to think the commander and his chief officers were born in the low latitudes. There must be southern blood in them. But as to whether they're Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or East Indians, their physical characteristics don't give me enough to go on. And as for their speech, it's utterly incomprehensible." "That's the nuisance in not knowing every language," Conseil replied, "or the drawback in not having one universal language." "Which would all go out the window," Ned Land replied. "Don't you see, these people have a language all to themselves, a language they've invented just to cause despair in decent people who ask for a little dinner. Why, in every country on earth, when you open your mouth, smack your jaws, smack your lips and teeth, isn't that the world's most understandable message? From Quebec to the Tuamotu Islands, from Paris to the Antipodes, doesn't it mean, 'I'm hungry, give me a bite to eat'?" "Oh," Conseil put in, "there are some people so unintelligent by nature." As he was saying those words, the door opened. A steward entered. He brought us some clothes, jackets, and sailor's pants made up of fabric whose nature I didn't recognize. I hurried to change into them, and my companions followed suit. Meanwhile, our silent steward, perhaps a deaf-mute, set the table and laid 3 place settings. There's something serious afoot, Conseil said, and it bodes well. Bah, replied the rancorous harpooner. What the devil do you suppose they eat around here? Turtle livers, loin of shark, dogfish steaks? We'll soon find out, Conseil said. Overlaid with silver dish covers, various platters had been neatly positioned on the tablecloth, and we sat down to eat. Assuredly, we were dealing with civilized people, and if it hadn't been for this electric light flooding over us, I would have thought we were in the dining room of the Hotel Adelphi in Liverpool, or the Grand Hotel in Paris. However, I feel compelled to mention that bread and wine were totally absent. The water was fresh and clear, but it was still water, which wasn't what Ned Land had in mind. Among the foods we were served, I was able to identify various daintily dressed fish, but I couldn't make up my mind about certain otherwise excellent dishes, and I couldn't even tell whether their contents belonged to the vegetable or the animal kingdom. As for the tableware, it was elegant and in perfect taste. Each utensil, spoon, fork, knife, and plate bore on its reverse a letter encircled by a Latin motto, and here is its exact duplicate: Mobilis in mobili, with the letter N. Moving within the moving element. It was a highly appropriate motto for this underwater machine, so long as the preposition in is translated as within and not upon. The letter N was no doubt the initial of the name of that mystifying individual in command beneath the seas. Ned and Conseil had no time for such musings. They were wolfing down their food, and without further ado I did the same. By now I felt reassured about our fate, and it seemed obvious that our host didn't intend to let us die of starvation. But all earthly things come to an end, all things must pass, even the hunger of people who haven't eaten for 15 hours. Our appetites appeased, we felt an urgent need for sleep, a natural reaction after that interminable night of fighting for our lives. Ye gods, I'll sleep soundly, Conseil said. Me, I'm out like a light, Ned Land replied. My two companions lay down on the cabin's carpeting and were soon deep in slumber. As for me, I gave in less readily to this intense need for sleep. Too many thoughts had piled up in my mind, too many insoluble questions had arisen, too many images were keeping my eyelids open. Where were we? What strange power was carrying us along? I felt, or at least I thought I did, the submersible sinking towards the sea's lower strata. Intense nightmares besieged me. In these mysterious marine sanctuaries, I envisioned hosts of unknown animals, and this underwater boat seemed to be a blood relation of theirs, living, breathing, just as fearsome. Then my mind grew calmer, my imagination melted into hazy drowsiness, and I soon fell into an uneasy slumber. Chapter 9. The Tantrums of Ned Land. I have no idea how long the slumber lasted, but it must have been a good while, since we were completely over our exhaustion. I was the first one to wake up. My companions weren't yet stirring and still lay in their corners like inanimate objects. I had barely gotten up from my passably hard mattress when I felt my mind clear, my brain go on the alert. So I began a careful re-examination of our cell. Nothing had changed in its interior arrangements. The prison was still a prison, and its prisoners still prisoners. But taking advantage of our slumber, the steward had cleared the table. Consequently, nothing indicated any forthcoming improvement in our situation, and I seriously wondered if we were doomed to spend the rest of our lives in this cage. This prospect seemed increasingly painful to me because, even though my brain was clear of its obsessions from the night before, I was feeling an odd short-windedness in my chest. It was becoming hard for me to breathe. The heavy air was no longer sufficient for the full play of my lungs. Although our cell was large, we obviously had used up most of the oxygen it contained. In essence, over an hour's time, a single human being consumes all the oxygen found in 100 liters of air, at which point that air has become charged with a nearly equal amount of carbon dioxide and is no longer fit for breathing. So it was now urgent to renew the air in our prison, and no doubt the air in this whole underwater boat as well. Here a question popped into my head. How did the commander of this aquatic residence go about it? Did he obtain air using chemical methods, releasing the oxygen contained in potassium chlorate by heating it, meanwhile absorbing the carbon dioxide with potassium hydroxide? If so, he would have to keep up some kind of relationship with the shore to come by the materials needed for such an operation. Did he simply limit himself to storing the air in high-pressure tanks and then dispense it according to his crew's needs? Perhaps. Or, proceeding in a more convenient, more economical, and consequently more probable fashion, Was he satisfied with merely returning to breathe at the surface of the water like a cetacean, renewing his oxygen supply every 24 hours? In any event, whatever his method was, it seemed prudent to me that he use this method without delay. In fact, I had already resorted to speeding up my exhalations in order to extract from the cell what little oxygen it contained, when suddenly I was refreshed by a current of clean air, scented with a salty aroma. It had to be a sea breeze, life-giving and charged with iodine. I opened my mouth wide, and my lungs glutted themselves on the fresh particles. At the same time, I felt a swaying, a rolling, of moderate magnitude, but definitely noticeable. This boat, this sheet iron monster, had obviously just risen to the surface of the ocean, there to breathe in good whale fashion, though the ship's mode of ventilation was finely established. When I had absorbed a chestful of this clean air, I looked for the conduit, the air carrier, if you prefer, that allowed this beneficial influx to reach us, and I soon found it. Above the door opened an air vent that let in a fresh current of oxygen, renewing the thin air in our cell. I'd gotten to this point in my observations when Ned and Conseil woke up almost simultaneously under the influence of this reviving air purification. They rubbed their eyes, stretched their arms, and sprang to their feet. "Did master sleep well?" Conseil asked me with his perennial good manners. "Extremely well, my gallant lad," I replied. "And how about you, Mr. Ned Land?" "Like a log, Professor, but I must be imagining things because it seems like I'm breathing a sea breeze." A seaman couldn't be wrong on this topic, and I told the Canadian what had gone on while he slept. "Good," he said. "That explains perfectly all that bellowing we heard when our so-called narwhal lay in sight of the Abraham Lincoln." "Perfectly, Mr. Land. It was catching its breath." "Only I've no idea what time it is, Professor Aronnax, unless maybe it's dinner time." "Dinner time, my fine harpooner? I'd say at least breakfast time, because we've certainly woken up to a new day." "Which indicates," Conseil replied, "that we've spent 24 hours in slumber." "That's my assessment," I replied. "I won't argue with you," Ned Land answered, "but dinner or breakfast, that steward will be plenty welcome whether he brings the one or the other." "The one and the other," Conseil said. "Well put," the Canadian replied. "We deserve 2 meals, and speaking for myself, I'll do justice to them both." "All right, Ned, let's wait and see," I replied. "It's clear that these strangers don't intend to let us die of hunger. Otherwise, last evening's dinner wouldn't make any sense." "Unless they're fattening us up," Ned shot back. "I object," I replied. "We have not fallen into the hands of cannibals." "Just because they don't make a habit of it," the Canadian replied in all seriousness, "doesn't mean they don't indulge from time to time. Who knows? Maybe these people have gone without fresh meat for a long while. In that case, 3 healthy, well-built specimens like the professor, his manservant, and me. Get rid of those ideas, Mr. Land," I answered the harpooner. "And above all, don't let them lead you to flare up against our host, which would only make our situation worse." "Anyhow," the harpooner said, "I'm as hungry as all Hades, and dinner or breakfast, not one puny meal has arrived." "Mr. Land," I answered, "we have to adapt to the schedule on board, and I imagine our stomachs are running ahead of the chief cook's dinner bell." "Well then, we'll adjust our stomachs to the chef's timetable," Conseil replied serenely. "There you go again, Conseil, my friend," the impatient Canadian shot back. "You never allow yourself any displays of bile or attacks of nerves. You're everlastingly calm. You'd say you were after dinner graves even if you didn't get any food for your before-meal blessing. And you'd starve to death rather than complain." "What good would it do?" Conseil asked. "Complaining doesn't have to do good. It just feels good. And if these pirates, I say pirates out of consideration for the professor's feelings, because he doesn't want to call them cannibals, if these pirates think they're going to smother me in this cage without hearing what cuss words spice up my outbursts, they've got another thing coming. Look here, Professor Aronnax, speak frankly. How long do you figure they'll keep us in this iron box?" "To tell the truth, friend Land, I know little more about it than you do. But in a nutshell, what do you suppose is going on?" "My supposition is that sheer chance has made us privy to an important secret. Now then, if the crew of this underwater boat have a personal interest in keeping that secret, and if their personal interest is more important than the lives of 3 men, I believe that our very existence is in jeopardy. If such is not the case, then at the first available opportunity, this monster that has swallowed us will return us to the world inhabited by our own kind." "Unless they recruit us to serve on the crew," Conseil said, "and keep us here?" Till the moment, Ned Land answered, when some frigate that's faster or smarter than the Abraham Lincoln captures this den of buccaneers and then hangs all of us by the neck from the tip of a mainmast yardarm. Well thought out, Mr. Land, I replied, but as of yet, I don't believe we've been tendered any enlistment offers. Consequently, it's pointless to argue about what tactics we should pursue in such a case. I repeat, let's wait, let's be guided by events, and let's do nothing, since right now there's nothing we can do. On the contrary, Professor, the harpooner replied, not wanting to give in. There's something we can do. Oh, and what, Mr. Land? Break out of here. Breaking out of a prison on shore is difficult enough, but with an underwater prison, it strikes me as completely unworkable. Come now, Ned, my friend, Conseil asked. How would you answer Masco's objection? I refuse to believe that an American is at the end of his tether. Visibly baffled, the harpooner said nothing. Under the conditions in which fate had left us, it was utterly impossible to escape. But a Canadian's wit is half French, and Mr. Ned Land made this clear in his reply. So, Professor Aronnax, he went on after thinking for a few moments, you haven't figured out what people do when they can't escape from their prison? No, my friend. Easy. They fix things so they stay there. Of course, Conseil put in. Since we're deep in the ocean, being inside this boat is vastly preferable than being above it or below it. But we fix things by kicking out all the jailers, guards, and wardens, Ned Land added. What's this, Ned? I asked. You'd seriously consider taking over this craft? Very seriously, the Canadian replied. It's impossible. And why's that, sir? Some promising opportunity might come up, and I don't see what could stop us from taking advantage of it. If there are only about 20 men on board this machine, I don't think they can stave off 2 Frenchmen and a Canadian. It seemed wiser to accept the harpooner's proposition than to debate it. Accordingly, I was content to reply, let such circumstances come, Mr. Land, and we'll see. But until then, I beg you to control your impatience. We need to act shrewdly, and your flare-ups won't give rise to any promising opportunities. So swear to me that you'll accept our situation without throwing a tantrum over it. I give you my word, Professor, Ned Land replied in an unenthusiastic tone. No vehement phrases will leave my mouth. No vicious gestures will give my feelings away, not even when they don't feed us on time. I have your word, Ned, I answered the Canadian. Then our conversation petered out, and each of us withdrew into his own thoughts. For my part, despite the harpooner's confident talk, I admit that I entertained no illusions. I had no faith in these promising opportunities that Ned Land mentioned. To operate with such efficiency, this underwater boat had to have a sizable crew, so that if it came to a physical contest, we would be facing an overwhelming opponent. Besides, before we could do anything, we had to be free, and that we definitely were not. I didn't see any way out of the sheet iron, hermetically sealed cell, and if the strange commander of this boat did have a secret to keep, which seemed rather likely, he would never give us freedom of movement aboard his vessel. Now then, would he resort to violence in order to be rid of us, or would he drop us off one day on some remote coast? There lay the unknown. All these hypotheses seemed extremely plausible to me, and to hope for freedom through use of force, you had to be a harpooner. I realized, moreover, that Ned Land's brooding was getting him madder by the minute. Little by little, I heard those aforesaid cuss words swelling up in the depths of his gullet, and I saw his movements turn threatening again. He stood up, pacing in circles like a wild beast in a cage, striking the walls with his foot and fist. Meanwhile, the hours passed, our hunger nagged unmercifully, and this time the steward did not appear, which amounted to forgetting our castaway status for much too long, if they really had good intention toward us. Tortured by the growling of his well-built stomach, Ned Land was growing more and more riled, and despite his word of honor, I was in real dread of an explosion when he stood in the presence of one of the men on board. For 2 more hours, Ned Land's rage increased. The Canadian shouted and pleaded, but to no avail. The sheet iron walls were deaf. I didn't hear a single sound inside this dead-seeming boat. The vessel hadn't stirred because I obviously would have felt its hull vibrating under the influence of the propeller. It had undoubtedly sunk into the watery deep and no longer belonged to the outside world. All this dismal silence was terrifying. As for our neglect, our isolation in the depths of this cell, I was afraid to guess at how long it might last. Little by little, hopes I had entertained after our interview with the ship's commander were fading away. The gentleness of the man's gaze, the generosity expressed in his facial features, the nobility of his bearing, all vanished from my memory. I saw this mystifying individual anew for what he inevitably must be, cruel and merciless. I viewed him as outside humanity, beyond all feelings of compassion, the implacable foe of his fellow man toward whom he must have sworn in undying hate. But even so, was the man going to let us die of starvation, locked up in this cramped prison, exposed to those horrible temptations to which people are driven by extreme hunger? The grim possibility took on an dreadful intensity in my mind, and fired by imagination, I felt an unreasoning terror run through me. Conseil stayed calm. Ned Land bellowed. Just then, a noise was audible outside. Footsteps rang on the metal tiling. The locks were turned, the door opened, the steward appeared. Before I could make a single movement to prevent him, the Canadian rushed at the poor man, threw him down, held him by the throat. The steward was choking in the grip of those powerful hands. Conseil was already trying to loosen the harpooner's hands from his half-suffocated victim, and I had gone to join in the rescue, when I was abruptly nailed to the spot by these words pronounced in French. "Calm down, Mr. Land. And you, Professor, kindly listen to me." Chapter 10. The Man of the Waters. It was the ship's commander who had just spoken. At these words, Ned Land stood up quickly. Nearly strangled, the steward staggered out at a signal from his superior, but such was the commander's authority aboard his vessel. Not one gesture gave away the resentment that this man must have felt toward the Canadian. In silence, we waited for the outcome of this scene. Conseil, in spite of himself, seemed almost fascinated. I was stunned. Arms crossed, leaning against a corner of the table, the commander studied us with great care. Was he reluctant to speak further? Did he regret those words he had just pronounced in French? You would have thought so. After a few moments of silence, in which none of us would have dreamed of interrupting, "Gentlemen," he said in a calm, penetrating voice, "I speak French, English, German, and Latin with equal fluency. Hence I could have answered you as early as our initial interview, but first I wanted to make your acquaintance and then think things over. Your 4 versions of the same narrative, perfectly consistent by and large, establish your personal identities for me. I now know that by sheer chance has placed in my presence Professor Pierre Aronnax, specialist in natural history at the Paris Museum and entrusted with a scientific mission abroad, his manservant Conseil, and Ned Land, a harpooner of Canadian origin aboard the Abraham Lincoln, a frigate in the National Navy of the United States of America." I bowed in agreement. The commander hadn't put a question to me, so no answer was called for. This man expressed himself with perfect ease and without a trace of an accent. His phrasing was clear, his words well chosen, his facility in elocution remarkable. And yet, to me, he didn't have the feel of a fellow countryman. He went on with the conversation as followed. "No doubt, sir, you felt that I waited for rather too long before paying you this second visit. After discovering your identities, I wanted to weigh carefully what policy to pursue toward you. I had great difficulty deciding. Some extreme, inconvenient circumstances have brought you into the presence of a man who has cut himself off from humanity. Your coming has disrupted my whole existence." "Unintentionally," I said. "Unintentionally?" the stranger replied, raising his voice a little. "Was it unintentionally that the Abraham Lincoln hunted me on every sea? Was it unintentionally that you traveled aboard that frigate? Was it unintentionally that your shells bounced off my ship's hull? Was it unintentionally that Mr. Ned Land hit me with his harpoon?" I detected a controlled irritation in these words, but there was a perfectly natural reply to these charges, and I made it. "Sir," I said, "you're surely unaware of the discussions that have taken place in Europe and America with yourself as the subject. You don't realize that various accidents caused by collisions with your underwater machine have aroused public passions on these 2 continents. I'll spare you the innumerable hypotheses with which we try to explain this inexplicable phenomenon, whose secret is yours alone. But please understand that the Abraham Lincoln chased you over the Pacific high seas in the belief that it was haunting some powerful marine monster, which had to be purged from the ocean at all cost." A half smile curled the commander's lips. Then, in a calmer tone, "Professor Aronnax," he replied, "do you dare claim that your frigate wouldn't have chased and cannonaded an underwater boat as readily as a monster?" This question baffled me, since Commander Farragut would certainly have shown no such hesitation. He would have seen it as his sworn duty to destroy a contrivance of this kind just as promptly as a giant narwhal. So you understand, sir, the stranger went on, that I have a right to treat you as my enemy. He kept quiet with good reason. What was the use of debating such a proposition when superior force can wipe out the best arguments? It took me a good while to decide, the commander went on. Nothing obliged me to grant you hospitality. If I were to part company with you, I'd have no personal interest in ever seeing you again. I could put you back on the platform of this ship that has served as your refuge. I could sink under the sea, and I could forget you ever existed. Wouldn't that be my right? Perhaps it would be the right of a savage, I replied, but not that of a civilized man. Professor, the commander replied swiftly, I'm not what you term a civilized man. I've severed all ties with society for reasons that I alone have the right to appreciate. Therefore, I obey none of its regulations, and I insist that you never invoke them in front of me. This was plain speaking. A flash of anger and scorn lit up the stranger's eyes, and I glimpsed a fearsome past in this man's life. Not only had he placed himself beyond human laws, he had rendered himself independent, out of all reach, free in the strictest sense of the word. For who would dare chase him to the depths of the sea when he thwarted all attacks on the surface? What ship could withstand a collision with its underwater monitor? What armor plate, no matter how heavy, could bear the thrusts of his spur? No man among men could call him to account for his actions. God, if he believed in him, his conscience, if he had one, those were the only judges to whom he was answerable. These thoughts swiftly crossed my mind while the strange individual fell silent, like someone completely self-absorbed. I regarded him with a mixture of fear and fascination, in the same way, no doubt, that Oedipus regarded the Sphinx. After a fairly long silence, the commander went on with our conversation. So I had difficulty deciding, he said, but I concluded that my personal interests could be reconciled with that natural compassion to which every human being has a right. Since fate has brought you here, you'll stay aboard my vessel. You'll be free here, and in exchange for that freedom, moreover totally related to it, I'll lay on you just one condition. Your word that you'll submit to it will be sufficient. Go on, sir, I replied. I assume this condition is one an honest man can accept. Yes, sir, just this. It's possible that certain unforeseen events may force me to confine you to your cabins for some hours, or even for some days, as the case may be. Since I prefer never to use violence, I expect from you in such a case, even more than in any other, your unquestioning obedience. By acting in this way, I shield you from complicity. I absolve you of all responsibility, since I make it impossible for you to see what you aren't meant to see. Do you accept this condition? So things happened on board that were quite odd, to say the least. Things never to be seen by people not placing themselves beyond society's laws. Among all the surprises the future had in store for me, this would not be the mildest. We accept, I replied. Only, I'll ask your permission, sir, to address a question to you. Just one. Go ahead, sir. You said we'd be free aboard your vessel. Completely. Then I would ask what you mean by this freedom. Why, the freedom to come, go, see, and even closely observe everything happening here, except under certain rare circumstances. In short, the freedom we ourselves enjoy, my companions and I. It was obvious that we did not understand one another. Pardon me, sir, I went on, but that's merely the freedom that every prisoner has, the freedom to pace his cell. That's not enough for us. Nevertheless, it will have to do. What? We must give up seeing our homeland, friends, and relatives ever again? Yes, sir, but giving up that intolerable earthly yoke is that some men call freedom is perhaps less painful than you think. By thunder, Ned Land shouted. I'll never promise I won't try getting out of here. I didn't ask for such a promise, Mr. Land, the commander replied coldly. Sir, I replied, flaring up in spite of myself, you're taking unfair advantage of it. This is sheer cruelty. No, sir, it's an act of mercy. You're my prisoners of war. I've cared for you when, with a single word, I could plunge you back into the ocean depths. You attacked me. You've just stumbled on a secret no living man must probe. The secret of my entire existence. Do you think I'll send you back to a world that must know nothing more of me? Never. By keeping you on board, it isn't you whom I care for, it's me. These words indicated that the commander pursued a policy impervious to arguments. Then, sir, I went on. You give us, quite simply, a choice between life and death. Quite simply. My friends, I said, to a question couched in these terms, our answer can be taken for granted, but no solemn promises bind us to the commander of this vessel. None, sir, the stranger replied. Then, in a gentler voice, he went on, Now allow me to finish what I have to tell you. I've heard of you, Professor Aronnax. You, if not your companions, won't perhaps complain too much about the stroke of fate that has brought us together. Among the books that make up my favorite reading, you'll find the work you've published on the great ocean depths. I've pored over it. You've taken your studies as far as terrestrial science can go. But you don't know everything because you haven't seen everything. Let me tell you, Professor, you won't regret the time you spend aboard my vessel. You're going to voyage through a land of wonders. Stunned amazement will probably be your habitual state of mind. It will be a long while before you tire of the sights constantly before your eyes. I'm going to make another underwater tour of the world, perhaps my last, who knows? And I'll review everything I've studied in the depths of these seas that I've crossed so often. And you can be my fellow student. Starting this very day, you'll enter a new element. You'll see what no human being has ever seen before, since my men and I no longer count. And thanks to me, you're going to learn the ultimate secrets of our planet. I can't deny it. The commander's words had a tremendous effect on me. He had caught me on my weak side, and I momentarily forgot that not even this sublime experience was worth the loss of my freedom. Besides, I counted on the future to resolve this important question. So I was content to reply, Sir, even though you've cut yourself off from humanity, I can see you haven't disowned all human feeling. We're castaways whom you've charitably taken aboard. We'll never forget that. Speaking for myself, I don't rule out that the interests of science could override even the need for freedom, which promises me that in exchange our encounter will provide great rewards. I thought the commander would offer me his hand to seal our agreement. He did nothing of the sort. I regretted that. One last question, I said, just as this inexplicable being seemed ready to withdraw. Ask it, Professor. By what name am I to call you? Sir, the commander replied, to you, I'm simply Captain Nemo. To me, you and your companions are simply passengers on the Nautilus. Captain Nemo called out. A steward appeared. The captain gave him his orders in that strange language I couldn't identify. Then, turning to the Canadian and Conseil, a meal is waiting for you in your cabin, he told them. Kindly follow this man. That's an offer I can't refuse, the harpooner replied. After being confined for over 30 hours, he and Conseil were finally out of the cell. And now, Professor Aronnax, our own breakfast is ready. Allow me to lead the way. Yours to command, Captain. I followed Captain Nemo, and as soon as I passed through the doorway, I went down a kind of electrically lit passageway that resembled a gangplank on a ship. After a stretch of some 10 meters, a second door opened before me. I then entered a dining room, decorated and furnished in austere good taste. Inlaid with ebony trim, tall oaken sideboards stood at both ends of this room, and sparkling on their shelves were staggered rows of earthenware, porcelain, and glass of incalculable value. Their silver-plated dinnerware gleamed under rays pouring from light fixtures in the ceiling, whose glare was softened and tempered by delicately painted designs. In the center of this room stood a table, richly spread. Captain Nemo indicated the place I was to occupy. Be seated, he told me, and eat like the famished man you must be. Our breakfast consisted of several dishes whose contents were all supplied by the sea, and some foods whose nature and derivation were unknown to me. They were good, I admit, but with a peculiar flavor to which I would soon grow accustomed. These various food items seemed to be rich in phosphorus, and I thought that they, too, must have been of marine origin. Captain Nemo stared at me. I had asked him nothing, but he read my thoughts, and on his own he answered the questions I was itching to address him. Most of these dishes are new to you, he told me, but you can consume them without fear. They're healthy and nourishing. I renounced terrestrial foods long ago, and I'm none the worse for it. My crew are strong and full of energy, and they eat what I eat. So, I said, all these foods are products of the sea? Yes, Professor, the sea supplies all my needs. Sometimes I cast my nets in our wake, and I pull them up ready to burst. Sometimes I go hunting right in the midst of this element that has long seemed so far out of man's reach, and I corner the game that dwells in my underwater forests. Like the flocks of old Proteus, King Neptune's shepherd, my herds graze without fear on the ocean's immense prairies. There I own vast properties that I harvest myself, and which are forever sown by the hand of the Creator of all things." I stared at Captain Nemo in definite astonishment, and I answered him, "Sir, I understand perfectly how your nets can furnish excellent fish for your table. I understand less how you can chase aquatic game in your underwater forests. But how a piece of red meat, no matter how small, can figure in your menu, that I don't understand at all." "Nor I, sir," Captain Nemo answered me. "I never touch the flesh of land animals." "Nevertheless, this," I went on, pointing to a dish where some slices of loin were still left, "what you believe to be red meat, Professor, is nothing other than loin of sea turtle. Similarly, here are some dolphin livers you might mistake for stewed pork. My chef is an skillful food processor who excels at pickling and preserving these various exhibits from the ocean. Feel free to sample all these foods. Here are some preserves of sea cucumber that a Malaysian would declare to be unrivaled in the entire world. Here's cream from milk furnished by the udders of cetaceans, and sugar from the huge fucus plant in the North Sea. And finally, allow me to offer you some marmalade of sea anemone, equal to that from the tastiest fruits." So I sampled away, more as a curiosity seeker than an epicure, while Captain Nemo delighted me with his incredible anecdotes. "But this sea, Professor Aronnax," he told me, "this prodigious, inexhaustible wet nurse of a sea not only feeds me, she dresses me as well. That fabric covering you was woven from the masses of filaments that anchor certain seashells. As the ancients were wont to do, it was dyed with purple ink from the murex snail, and shaded with violet tints that I extract from marine slug, the Mediterranean sea hare. The perfumes you'll find on the washstand in your cabin were produced from the oozings of marine plants. Your mattress was made from the ocean's softest eelgrass. Your quill pen will be whalebone, your ink a juice secreted by cuttlefish or squid. Everything comes to me from the sea, just as someday everything will return to it." "You love the sea, Captain." "Yes, I love it. The sea is the be-all and end-all. It covers 7/10 of the planet Earth. Its breath is clean and healthy. It's an immense wilderness where a man is never lonely because he feels life astir on every side. The sea is simply the vehicle for a prodigious, unearthly mode of existence. It's simply movement and love. It's living infinity, as one of your poets put it. And in essence, Professor, nature here is here made manifest by all three of her kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, and animal. The last of these is amply represented by the 4 zoophyte groups, 3 classes of articulates, 5 classes of mollusks, and 3 vertebrate classes, mammals, reptiles, and those countless legions of fish, an infinite order of animals totaling more than 13,000 species, of which only 1/10 belong to fresh water. The sea is a vast pool of nature. Our globe began with the sea, so to speak, and who can say we won't end with it? Here lies supreme tranquility. The sea doesn't belong to tyrants. On the surface, they can still exercise their iniquitous claims, battle each other, devour each other, haul every earthly horror. But 30 feet below sea level, their dominion ceases, their influence fades, their power vanishes. Ah, sir, live in the heart of the seas. Here alone lies independence. Here I recognize no superiors. Here I'm free." Captain Nemo suddenly fell silent in the midst of this enthusiastic outpouring. Had he let himself get carried away past the bounds of his habitual reserve? Had he said too much? For a few moments he strolled up and down, all aquiver. Then his nerves grew calmer, his facial features recovered their usual icy composure, and turning to me, "Now, Professor," he said, "if you'd like to inspect the Nautilus, I'm yours to command." Chapter 11. The Nautilus. Captain Nemo stood up. I followed him. Contrived at the rear of the dining room, a double door opened, and I entered a room whose dimensions equaled the one I had just left. It was a library. Tall, black rosewood bookcases, inlaid with copperwork, held on their wide shelves a large number of uniformly bound books. These furnishings followed the contours of the room, the lower parts leading to huge couches upholstered in maroon leather and curved for maximum comfort. Light, movable reading stands which could be pushed away or pulled near as desired allowed books to be positioned on them for easy study. In the center stood a huge table covered with pamphlets, among which some newspapers, long out of date, were visible. Electric light flooded this whole harmonious totality, falling from 4 frosted half-globes set in the scrollwork of the ceiling. I stared in genuine wonderment at this room so ingeniously laid out, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Captain Nemo, I told my host, who had just stretched out on the couch. This is a library that would do credit to more than one continental palace, and I truly marvel to think I can go with you into the deepest seas. Where could one find greater silence or solitude, Professor? Captain Nemo replied. Did your study at the museum afford you such a perfect retreat? No, sir, and I might add that it's quite a humble one next to yours. You own 6,000 or 7,000 volumes here. 12,000, Professor Aronnax. They're my sole remaining ties with dry land. But I was done with the shore the day my Nautilus submerged for the first time under the waters. That day I purchased my last volumes, my last pamphlets, my last newspapers, and ever since I've chosen to believe that humanity no longer thinks or writes. In any event, Professor, these books are at your disposal, and you may use them freely. I thanked Captain Nemo and approached the shelves of this library. Written in every language, books on science, ethics, and literature were there in abundance, but I didn't see a single work on economics. They seemed to be strictly banned on board. One odd detail, all these books were shelved indiscriminately without regard to the language in which they were written, and this jumble proved that the Nautilus's captain could read fluently whatever volumes he chanced to pick up. Among these books I noted masterpieces by the greats of ancient and modern times, in other words, all of humanity's finest achievements in history, poetry, fiction, and science, from Homer to Victor Hugo, from Xenophon to Michelet, from Rabelais to Madame Georges Sand. But science, in particular, represented the major investment of this library. Books on mechanics, ballistics, hydrography, meteorology, geography, geology, etc., held a place there no less important than works on natural history, and I realized that they made up the captain's chief reading. There I saw the complete works of Humboldt, the complete Arago, as well as works by Foucault, Henry St. Clair, Deville, Chasselet, Milne Edwards, Quatrefages, John Tyndall, Faraday, Berthelot, Father Secchi, Peterman, Commander Maury, Louis Agassiz, etc., plus the transactions of France's Academy of Sciences, bulletins from the various geographical societies, etc., and in a prime location, those 2 volumes on the great ocean depths that had perhaps earned me this comparatively charitable welcome from Captain Nemo. Among the works of Joseph Bertrand, his book entitled The Founders of Astronomy even gave me a definite date, and since I knew it had appeared in the course of 1865, I concluded that the fitting out of the Nautilus hadn't taken place before then. Accordingly, 3 years ago, at the most, Captain Nemo had begun his underwater existence. Moreover, I hoped some books even more recent would permit me to pinpoint the date exactly. But I had plenty of time to look for them, and I didn't want to put off any longer our stroll through the wonders of the Nautilus. Sir, I told the captain, thank you for placing this library at my disposal. There are scientific treasures here, and I'll take advantage of them. This room isn't only a library, Captain Nemo said. It's also a smoking room. A smoking room? I exclaimed. Then one may smoke on board? Surely. In that case, sir, I'm forced to believe that you've kept up relations with Havana. None whatsoever, the captain replied. Try this cigar, Professor Aronnax, and even though it doesn't come from Havana, it will satisfy you if you're a connoisseur. I took the cigar offered me, whose shape recalled those from Cuba, but it seemed to be made of gold leaf. I lit it at a small brazier supported by an elegant bronze stand, and I inhaled my first whiffs with the relish of a smoker who hasn't had a puff in days. It's excellent, I said, but it's not from the tobacco plant. Right, the captain replied. This tobacco comes from neither Havana nor the Orient. It's a kind of nicotine-rich seaweed that the ocean supplies me, albeit sparingly. Do you still miss your Cubans, sir? Captain, I scorn them from this day forward. Then smoke these cigars whenever you like, without debating their origin. They bear no government seal of approval, but I imagine they're none the worse for it. On the contrary. Just then Captain Nemo opened a door facing the one by which I had entered the library, and I passed into an immense, splendidly lit lounge. It was a huge quadrilateral with canted corners, 10 meters long, 6 wide, 5 high. A luminous ceiling, decorated with delicate arabesques, distributed a soft, clear daylight over all the wonders gathered in this museum. For a museum it truly was, in which clever hands had spared no expense to amass every natural and artistic treasure, displaying them with the helter-skelter picturesqueness that it distinguishes a painter's studio. Some 30 pictures by the masters, uniformly framed and separated by gleaming panoplies of arms, adorned walls on which were stretched tapestries of austere design. There I saw canvases of the highest value, the likes of which I had marveled at in private European collections and art exhibitions. The various schools of the old masters were represented by a Raphael Madonna, a Virgin by Leonardo da Vinci, a Nymph by Correggio, a Woman by Titian, an Adoration of the Magi by Veronese, an Assumption of the Virgin by Murillo, a Holbein portrait, a Monk by Velasquez, a Martyr by Ribera, a Village Fair by Rubens, 2 Flemish landscapes by Teniers, 3 little genre paintings by Gerard Dow, Metsu, and Paul Potter, 2 canvases by Géricault and Proudhon, plus seascapes by Bakhuysen and Vernet. Among the works of modern art were pictures signed by Delacroix, Ingres, Decamps, Troyon, Meissonier, Debigny, and etc., and some wonderful miniature statues in marble or bronze, modeled after antiquity's finest originals, stood on their pedestals in the corners of this magnificent museum. As the Nautilus's commander had predicted, my mind was already starting to fall into that promised state of stunned amazement. "Professor," the strange man then said, "you must excuse the informality with which I receive you, and the disorder reigning in this lounge." "Sir," I replied, "without prying into who you are, might I venture to identify you as an artist?" "A collector, sir, nothing more. Formerly I loved acquiring these beautiful works created by the hand of man. I sought them greedily, ferreted them out tirelessly, and have been able to gather some objects of great value. They're my last mementos of these shores that are now dead for me. In my eyes, your modern artists are already as old as the ancients. They've existed for 2,000 or 3,000 years, and I mix them up in my mind. The masters are ageless." "What about these composers?" I said, pointing to sheet music by Weber, Rossini, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Meyerbeer, Harold, Wagner, Auber, Junot, Victor Massey, and a number of others scattered over a full-size piano organ, which occupied one of the wall panels in the lounge. "These composers," Captain Nemo answered me, "are the contemporaries of Orpheus, because in the annals of the dead, all chronological differences fade. And I'm dead, Professor, quite as dead as those friends of yours sleeping 6 feet under." Captain Nemo fell silent and seemed lost in reverie. I regarded him with intense excitement, silently analyzing his strange facial expression. Leaning his elbow on the corner of a valuable mosaic table, he no longer saw me. He had forgotten my very presence. I didn't disturb his meditations, but continued to pass in review the curiosities that enriched this lounge. After the works of art, natural rarities predominated. They consisted chiefly of plants, shells, and other exhibits from the ocean that must have been Captain Nemo's own personal finds. In the middle of the lounge, a jet of water, electrically lit, fell back into a basin made from a single large clam. The delicately festooned rim of this shell, supplied by the biggest mollusk in the class Acephala, measured about 6 meters in circumference, so it was even bigger than those fine giant clams given to King Francois I by the Republic of Venice, in which the Church of Saint Sulpice in Paris has made into 2 gigantic holy water fonts. Around this basin, inside elegant glass cases fastened with copper bands, they were classified and labeled the most valuable marine exhibits ever put before the eyes of a naturalist. My professorial glee may easily be imagined. The zoophyte branch offered some very unusual specimens from its 2 groups, the polyps and the echinoderms. In our first group, organ pipe coral, Gorgonian coral arranged into fan shapes, soft sponges from Syria, Isis coral from the Molucca Islands, sea pen coral, wonderful coral of the genus Virgillaria from the waters of Norway, various coral from the genus Umbrellularia, Isochronarial coral, then a whole series of those madrepores that my mentor, Professor Millen Edwards, has so shrewdly classified into divisions, and among which I noted the wonderful genus Flabellina, as well as the genus Ocalina from Reunion Island, plus a Neptune's chariot from the Caribbean Sea, every superb variety of coral, and in short, every species of these unusual polyparies that congregate to form entire islands that will one day turn into continents. Among the echinoderms, notable for being covered with spines, starfish, feather stars, sea lilies, free-swimming crinoids, Brittle stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, etc., represented a complete collection of the individuals in this group. An excitable conchologist would surely have fainted dead away before other, more numerous glass cases in which were classified specimens from the mollusk branch. There I saw a collection of incalculable value that I haven't time to describe completely. Among these exhibits, I'll mention, just for the record, an elegant royal hammer shell from the Indian Ocean, whose evenly spaced white spots stood out sharply against a base of red and brown, an imperial spiny oyster, brightly colored, bristling with thorns, a specimen rare to European museums whose value I estimated at over $20,000, a common hammer shell from the seas near Queensland, very hard to come by, exotic cockles from Senegal, fragile white bivalve shells that a single breath could pop like a soap bubble, several varieties of watering pot shell from Java, a sort of limestone tube fringed with leafy folds and much fought over by collectors, a whole series of top-shell snails, greenish-yellow ones fished up from American seas, others colored reddish-brown that patronized the waters off Queensland, the former coming from the Gulf of Mexico and notable for their overlapping shells, the latter some sun-carrier shells found in the southernmost seas. Finally, and rarest of all, the magnificent spurred star shell from New Zealand, then some wonderful peppery furrow shells, several valuable species of Cythera clams and Venus clams, the trellis Wendell trap snail from Tranquil Bar on India's east shore, a marbled turban snail gleaming with mother of pearl, green parrot shells from the seas of China, the virtually unknown cone snail from the genus Conodolus, every variety of cowrie used as money in India and Africa, a glory of the seas, the most valuable shell in the East Indies, finally common periwinkles, Delphinula snails, turret snails, violet snails, European cowries, volute snails, olive shells, mitre shells, helmet shells, murex snails, whelks, harps shells, spiky periwinkles, triton snails, horn shells, spindle shells, conch shells, spider conchas, limpets, glass snails, sea butterflies, every kind of delicate, fragile seashell that science has baptized with its most delightful names. Aside and in special compartments, strings of supremely beautiful pearls were spread out, the electric light flecking them with little fiery sparks. Pink pearls pulled from saltwater fan shells in the Red Sea, green pearls from the rainbow abalone, red, blue, yellow, blue, and black pearls, the unusual handiwork of various mollusks from every ocean and of certain mussels from rivers up north. In short, several specimens of incalculable worth that had been oozed up by the rarest of shellfish. Some of these pearls were bigger than a pigeon egg. They more than equaled the one that the explorer Tavernier sold the Shah of Persia for $3 million, and they surpassed the other pearl owned by the Imam of Muscat, which I had believed to be unrivaled in the entire world. Consequently, to calculate the value of this collection was, I should say, impossible. Captain Nemo must have spent millions in acquiring these different specimens, and I was wondering what financial resources he tapped to satisfy his collector's fancies, when these words interrupted me. "You're examining my shells, Professor. They're indeed able to fascinate a naturalist, but for me they have an added charm, since I've collected every one of them with my own two hands, and not a sea on the globe has escaped my investigation." "I understand, Captain, I understand your delight at strolling in the midst of this wealth. You're a man who gathers his treasure in person. No museum in Europe owns such a collection of exhibits from the ocean. But if I exhaust all my wonderment on them, I'll have nothing left for the ship that carries them. I have absolutely no wish to probe those secrets of yours. But I confess that my curiosity is aroused to the limit by this Nautilus, the motor power it contains, the equipment, enabling it to operate the ultra-powerful force that brings it to life. I see some instruments hanging on the walls of this lounge whose purposes are unknown to me. May I learn—" "Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo answered me, "I've said you'll be free aboard my vessel, so no part of the Nautilus is off limits to you. You may inspect it in detail, and I'll be delighted to act as your guide." "I don't know how to thank you, sir, but I won't abuse your good nature. I would only ask about the uses intended for these instruments of physical measure. Professor, these same instruments are found in my stateroom, where I'll have the pleasure of explaining their functions to you. But beforehand, come inspect the cabin set aside for you. You need to learn how you'll be lodged aboard the Nautilus." I followed Captain Nemo, who, via one of the doors cut into the lounge's canted corners, led me back down the ship's gangways. He took me to the bow, and there I found not just a cabin, but an elegant stateroom with a bed, a washstand, and various other furnishings. I could only thank my host. Your stateroom adjoins mine, he told me, opening a door, and mine leads into that lounge we've just left. I entered the captain's stateroom. It had an austere, almost monastic appearance. An iron bedstead, a work table, some washstand fixtures, subdued lighting, no luxuries, just the bare necessities. Captain Nemo showed me to a bench. Kindly be seated, he told me. I sat, and he began speaking as follows. Chapter 12. Everything through electricity. Sir, Captain Nemo said, showing me the instruments hanging on the walls of his stateroom. These are the devices needed to navigate the Nautilus. Here, as in the lounge, I always have them before my eyes, and they indicate my position, an exact heading in the midst of the ocean. You're familiar with some of them, such as the thermometer, which gives the temperature inside the Nautilus, the barometer, which measures the heaviness of the outside air and forecasts changes in the weather, the humidistat, which indicates the degree of dryness in the atmosphere, the storm glass, whose mixture decomposes to foretell the arrival of tempests, the compass, which steers my course, the sextant, which takes the sun's altitude and tells me my latitude, chronometers, which allow me to calculate my longitude, and finally spyglasses for both day and night, enabling me to scrutinize every point of the horizon once the Nautilus has risen to the surface of the waves. These are the normal navigational instruments, I replied, and I'm familiar with their uses. But no doubt these others answer pressing needs unique to the Nautilus. The dial I see there, with the needle moving across it, isn't that a pressure gauge? It is indeed a pressure gauge. It's placed in contact with the water, and it indicates the outside pressure on our hull, which in turn gives me the depth at which my submersible is sitting. And these are some new breed of sounding line? They're thermometric sounding lines that report water temperatures in the different strata. And these other instruments, whose functions I can't even guess. Here, Professor, I need to give you some background information, Captain Nemo said. So kindly hear me out. He fell silent for some moments, then he said, There's a powerful, obedient, swift, and effortless force that can be bent to any use, and which reigns supreme aboard my vessel. It does everything. It lights me, it warms me, it's the soul of my mechanical equipment. This force is electricity. Electricity? I exclaimed with some surprise. Yes, sir. But, Captain, you have a tremendous speed of movement that doesn't square with the strength of electricity. Until now, its dynamic potential has remained quite limited, capable of producing only small amounts of power. Professor, Captain Nemo replied, my electricity isn't the run-of-the-mill variety, and with your permission, I'll leave it at that. I won't insist, sir, and I'll rest content with simply being flabbergasted at your results. I would ask one question, however, which you needn't answer if it's indiscreet. The electric cells you use to generate this marvelous force must be depleted very quickly. Their zinc component, for example, how do you replace it, since you no longer stay in contact with the shore? That question deserves an answer, Captain Nemo replied. First off, I'll mention that at the bottom of the sea there exist veins of zinc, iron, silver, and gold, whose mining would certainly be feasible. But I've tapped none of these land-based metals, and I wanted to make demands only on the sea itself for the sources of my electricity. The sea itself? Yes, Professor, and there was no shortage of such sources. In fact, by establishing a circuit between two wires immersed to different depths, I'd be able to obtain electricity through the diverging temperatures they experience, but I prefer to use a more practical procedure. And that is? You're familiar with the composition of salt water. In 1,000 grams, one finds 96.5 water and about 2.66% sodium chloride, then small quantities of magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, magnesium bromide, sulfate of magnesia, calcium sulfate, and calcium carbonate. Hence you observe that sodium chloride is encountered there in significant proportions. Now then, it's this sodium that I extract from salt water and with which I compose my electric cells. Sodium? Yes, sir. Mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam that takes the place of zinc in Bunsen cells. The mercury is never depleted. Only the sodium is consumed, and the sea itself gives me that. Beyond this, I'll mention that sodium batteries have been found to generate the greater energy, and their electromotor strength is twice that of zinc batteries. Captain, I fully understand the excellence of sodium under the conditions in which you're placed, The sea contains it, fine. But it still has to be produced, in short, extracted. And how do you accomplish this? Obviously, your batteries could do the extracting, but if I'm not mistaken, the consumption of sodium needed by your electric equipment would be greater than the quantity you'd extract. It would come about, then, that in the process of producing your sodium, you'd use up more than you'd make. Accordingly, Professor, I don't extract it with batteries. Quite simply, I utilize the heat of coal from the earth. From the earth, I said, my voice going up on the word. We'll say coal from the sea floor, if you prefer, Captain Nemo replied. And you can mine these veins of underwater coal? You'll watch me work them, Professor Aronnax. I ask only a little patience of you, since you'll have ample time to be patient. Just remember one thing. I owe everything to the ocean. It generates electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus heat, light, motion, and in a word, life itself. But not the air you breathe. Oh, I could produce the air needed on board, but it would be pointless since I can rise to the surface of the sea whenever I like. However, even though electricity doesn't supply me with breathable air, it at least operates the powerful pumps that store it under pressure in special tanks, which, if need be, allows me to extend my stay in the lower strata for as long as I want. Captain, I replied, I'll rest content with marveling. You've obviously found what all mankind will surely find one day, the true dynamic power of electricity. I'm not so certain they'll find it, Captain Nemo replied icily. But be that as it may, you're already familiar with the first use I found for this invaluable force. It lights us, and with a uniformity and continuity not even possessed by sunlight. Now, look at that clock. It's electric. It runs with an accuracy rivaling the finest chronometers. I've had it divided into 24 hours like Italian clocks, since neither day nor night, sun nor moon exist for me, but only this artificial light that I import into the depths of the seas. See, right now it's 10 o'clock in the morning. That's perfect. Another use for electricity, that dial hanging before our eyes indicates how fast the Nautilus is going. An electric wire puts it into contact with the patent log. This needle shows me the actual speed of my submersible, and, hold on, just now we're proceeding at the moderate pace of 15 miles per hour. It's marvelous, I replied, and I truly see, Captain, how right you are to use this force. It's sure to take the place of wind, water, and steam. But that's not all, Professor Aronnax, Captain Nemo said, standing up. And if you'll care to follow me, we'll inspect the Nautilus's stern. In essence, I was already familiar with the whole forward part of this underwater boat, and here are its exact subdivisions going from amidships to its spur. The dining room, 5 meters long and separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. In other words, it couldn't be penetrated by the sea. The library, 5 meters long. The main lounge, 10 meters long, separated from the captain's stateroom by a second watertight bulkhead. The aforesaid stateroom, 5 meters long. Mine, 2.5 meters long. And finally, air tanks, 7.5 meters long and extending to the stem post. Total, a length of 35 meters. Doors were cut into the watertight bulkheads and were shut hermetically by means of intra-rubber seals, which ensured complete safety aboard the Nautilus in the event of a leak in any one section. I followed Captain Nemo down gangplanks located for easy transit, and I arrived amidships. There I found a sort of shaft leading upward between two watertight bulkheads. An iron ladder clamped to the wall led to the shaft's upper end. I asked the captain what this ladder was for. It goes to the skiff, he replied. What? You have a skiff? I replied in some astonishment. Surely, an excellent longboat, light and unsinkable, which is used for excursions and fishing trips. But when you want to set out, don't you have to return to the surface of the sea? By no means. The skiff is attached to the top side of the Nautilus's hull and is set in a cavity expressly designed to receive it. It's completely decked over, absolutely watertight, and held solidly in place by bolts. This latter leads to a manhole cut into the Nautilus's hull and corresponding to a comparable hole cut into the side of the skiff. I insert myself through this double opening into the longboat. My crew close up the hole belonging to the Nautilus. I close up the one belonging to the skiff simply by screwing it into place. I undo the bolts holding the skiff to the submersible, and the longboat rises with prodigious speed to the surface of the sea. I then open the deck paneling, carefully closed until that point. I upmast and hoist sail, or I take out my oars, and I go for a spin. But how do you return to the ship? I don't, Professor Aronnax. The Nautilus returns to me. At your command? At my command. An electric wire connects me to the ship. I fire off a telegram, and that's that. Right, I said, tipsy from all these wonders. Nothing to it. After passing the well of the companionway that led to the platform, I saw a cabin 2 meters long into which Conseil and Ned Land, enraptured with their meal, were busy devouring it to the last crumb. Then a door opened into the galley, 3 meters long and located between the vessel's huge storage lockers. There, even more powerful and obedient than gas, electricity did most of the cooking. Arriving under the stoves, wires transmitted to platinum griddles a heat that was distributed and sustained with perfect consistency. It also heated a distilling mechanism that, via evaporation, supplied excellent drinking water. Next to this galley was a bathroom, conveniently laid out, with faucets supplying hot or cold water at will. After the galley came the crew's quarters, 5 meters long, but the doors closed and I couldn't see its accommodations, which might have told me the number of men it took to operate the Nautilus. At the far end stood a fourth watertight bulkhead, separating the crew's quarters from the engine room. A door opened, and I stood in the compartment where Captain Nemo, indisputably a world-class engineer, had set up his locomotive equipment. Brightly lit, the engine room measured at least 30 meters in length. It was divided by function into two parts. The first contained the cells for generating electricity, the second that mechanism transmitting movement to the propeller. Right off, I noticed an odor permeating the compartment that was sui generis. Captain Nemo noticed the negative impression it made on me. That, he told me, is a gaseous discharge caused by our use of sodium, but it's only a mild inconvenience. In any event, every morning we sanitize the ship by ventilating it in the open air. Meanwhile, I examined the Nautilus's engine with a fascination easy to imagine. You observe, Captain Nemo told me, that I use Bunsen cells, not Ruhmkorff cells. The latter would be ineffectual. One uses fewer Bunsen cells, but they're big and strong, and experience has proven their superiority. The electricity generated here makes its way to the stern, where electromagnets of huge size activate a special system of levers and gears that transmit movement to the propeller shaft. The latter has a diameter of 6 meters, a pitch of 7.5 meters, and can do up to 120 revolutions per minute. And that gives you a speed of 50 miles per hour. There lay a mystery, but I didn't insist on exploring it. How could electricity work with such power? Where did this nearly unlimited energy originate? Was it in the extraordinary voltage obtained from some new kind of induction coil? Could its transmission have been immeasurably increased by some unknown system of levers? This was the point I couldn't grasp. Captain Nemo, I said, I'll vouch for the results and not try to explain them. I've seen the Nautilus at work going out in front of the Abraham Lincoln, and I know where I stand on its speed. But it isn't enough just to move. We have to see where we're going. We must be able to steer right or left, up or down. How do you reach the lower depths where you meet an increasing resistance that's assessed in hundreds of atmospheres? How do you rise back to the surface of the ocean? Finally, how do you keep your ship at whatever level suits you? Am I indiscreet in asking you all these things? Not at all, Professor, the captain answered me after a slight hesitation, since you'll never leave this underwater boat. Come into the lounge. It's actually our workroom, and there you'll learn the full story about the Nautilus. Chapter 13. Some Figures. A moment later, we were seated on a couch in the lounge, cigars between our lips. The captain placed before my eyes a working drawing that gave the ground plan, cross-section, and side view of the Nautilus. Then he began his description as follows. Here, Professor Aronnax, are the different dimensions of this boat now transporting you. It's a very long cylinder with conical ends. It noticeably takes the shape of a cigar, a shape already adopted in London for several projects of the same kind. The length of this cylinder from end to end is exactly 70 meters, and its maximum breadth of beam is 8 meters. So it isn't quite built on the 10-to-1 ratio of your high-speed steamers, but its lines are sufficiently long, and they're tapering gradual enough so that the displaced water easily slips past. It poses no obstacle to the ship's movements. These two dimensions allow you to obtain, via a simple calculation, the surface area and volume of the Nautilus. Its surface area equals 1,011.45 square meters, its volume 1,507.2 cubic meters, which is tantamount to saying that when it's completely submerged, it displaces 1,500 cubic meters of water or weighs 1,500 metric tons. In drawing up plans for a ship meant to navigate underwater, I wanted it, when floating on the waves, to lie 9/10 below the surface and to emerge only 1/10. Consequently, under these conditions, it needed to displace only 9/10 of its volume, hence 1,356.48 cubic meters. In other words, it was to weigh only that same number of metric tons. So I was obliged not to exceed this weight while building it to the aforesaid dimensions. The Nautilus is made up of two hulls, one inside the other. Between them, joining them together, are iron T-bars that give this ship the utmost rigidity. In fact, thanks to this cellular arrangement, it has the resistance of a stone block, as if it were completely solid. Its plating can't give way, it's self-adhering and not dependent on the tightness of its rivets, and due to the perfect union of its materials, the solidarity of its construction allows it to defy the most violent seas. The two hulls are manufactured from boilerplate steel, whose relative density is 7.8 times that of water. The first hull has a thickness of no less than 5 centimeters and weighs 394.96 metric tons. My second hull, the outer cover, includes a keel 50 centimeters high by 25 wide, which by itself weighs 62 metric tons. This hull, the engine, the ballast, the various accessories and accommodations, plus the bulkheads and interior braces, have a combined weight of 961.52 metric tons, which, when added to 394.96 metric tons, gives us the desired total of 1,356.48 metric tons. Clear? Clear, I replied. So, the captain went on, when the Nautilus lies on the waves under these conditions, 1/10 of it does emerge above water. Now then, if I provide some ballast tanks equal in capacity to that 1/10, hence able to hold 150.72 metric tons, and if I fill them with water, the boat then displaces 1,507.2 metric tons, or it weighs that much, and it would be completely submerged. That's what comes about, Professor. These ballast tanks exist within easy access in the lower reaches of the Nautilus. I open some stopcocks, the tanks fill, the boat sinks, and it's exactly flush with the surface of the water. Fine, Captain, but now we come to a genuine difficulty. You're able to lie flush with the surface of the ocean, that I understand. But lower down, while driving beneath the surface, isn't your submersible going to encounter a pressure and consequently undergo an upward thrust, that must be assessed at 1 atmosphere every 30 feet of water, hence at about 1 kilogram per each square centimeter? Precisely, sir. Then, unless you fill up the whole Nautilus, I don't see how you can force it down into the heart of these liquid masses. Professor, Captain Nemo replied, static objects mustn't be confused with dynamic ones, or will be open to serious error. Comparatively little effort is spent in reaching the ocean's lowered regions, because all objects have a tendency to become sinkers. Follow my logic here. I'm all ears, Captain. When I wanted to determine what increase in weight the Nautilus needed to be given in order to submerge, I only had to take note of the proportionate reduction in volume that saltwater experiences in deeper and deeper strata. That's obvious, I replied. Now then, if water isn't absolutely incompressible, at least it compresses very little. In fact, according to the most recent calculation, this reduction is only 0.0000436 per atmosphere, or per every 30 feet of depth. For instance, to go 1,000 meters down, I must take into account the reduction in volume that occurs under a pressure equivalent to that from a 1,000-meter column of water, in other words, under a pressure of 100 atmospheres. In this instance, the reduction would be 0.00436. Consequently, I'd have to increase my weight from 1,507.2 metric tons to 1,513.77. So the added weight would only be 6.57 metric tons. That's all? That's all, Professor Aronnax, and the calculation is easy to check. Now then, I have supplementary ballast tanks capable of shipping 100 metric tons of water, so I can descend to considerable depths. When I want to rise again and lie flush with the surface, all I have to do is expel that water, and if I desire that the Nautilus to emerge above the waves to 1/10 of its total capacity, I empty all the ballast tanks completely. This logic, backed up by figures, left me without a single objection. I accept your calculations, Captain, I replied, and I'd be ill-mannered to dispute them since your daily experience bears them out. But at this juncture, I have a hunch that we're still left with one real difficulty. What's that, sir? When you're at a depth of 1,000 meters, the Nautilus's plating bears a pressure of 100 atmospheres. If at this point you want to empty the supplementary ballast tanks in order to lighten your boat and rise to the surface, your pumps must overcome that pressure of 100 atmospheres, which is 100 kilograms per each square centimeter. This demands a strength that electricity alone can give me, Captain Nemo said swiftly. Sir, I repeat, the dynamic power of my engines is nearly infinite. The Nautilus's pumps have prodigious strengths, as you must have noticed when their waterspouts swept like a torrent over the Abraham Lincoln. Besides, I use my supplementary ballast tanks only to reach an average depth of 1,500 to 2,000 meters, and that with a view to conserving my machinery. Accordingly, when I have a mind to visit the ocean depths 2 or 3 vertical leagues beneath the surface, I use maneuvers that are more time-consuming, but no less infallible. What are they, Captain? I asked. Here I'm naturally led into telling you how the Nautilus is maneuvered. Well, I can't wait to find out. In order to steer this boat to port or starboard, in short, to make turns on a horizontal plane, I use an ordinary wide-bladed rudder that's fastened to the rear of the stern post and worked by a wheel and tackle. But I can also move the Nautilus upward and downward on a vertical plane by the simple method of slanting its 2 fins, which are attached to its sides at the center of its flotation. These fins are flexible, able to assume any position, and can be operated from inside by means of powerful levers. If these fins stay parallel with the boat, the latter moves horizontally. If they slant, the Nautilus follows the angle of that slant and, under its propeller's thrust, either sinks on a diagonal as steep as it suits me, or rises on that diagonal. And similarly, if I want to return more swiftly to the surface, I throw the propeller in gear, and the water's pressure makes the Nautilus rise vertically as an air balloon inflated with hydrogen lifts swiftly into the skies. Bravo, Captain, I exclaimed, but in the midst of the waters, how can your helmsman follow the course you've given him? My helmsman is stationed behind the windows of a pilot house, which protrudes from the top side of the Nautilus's hull, and is fitted with biconvex glass. Is glass capable of resisting such pressures? Perfectly capable. Though fragile on impact, crystal can still offer considerable resistance. In 1864, during experiments on fishing by electric light in the middle of the North Sea, glass panes less than 7 millimeters thick were seen to resist a pressure of 16 atmospheres, all the while letting through strong, heat-generating rays whose warmth was unevenly distributed. Now then, I use glass windows measuring no less than 21 centimeters at their centers. In other words, they've 30 times the thickness. Fair enough, Captain, but if we're going to sea, we need light to drive away the dark, and in the midst of the murky waters, I wonder how your helmsman can set astern of the pilot house is a powerful electric reflector whose rays light up the sea for a distance of half a mile. Oh, bravo, bravo 3 times over, Captain. That explains the phosphorescent glow from the so-called narwhal that so puzzled us scientists. Pertinent to this, I'll ask you if the Nautilus is running afoul of the Scotia, which caused such great uproar, was the result of an accidental encounter? Entirely accidental, sir. I was navigating 2 meters beneath the surface of the water when the collision occurred. However, I could see that it had no dire consequences. None, sir, but as for your encounter with the Abraham Lincoln? Professor, that troubled me because it's one of the best ships in the gallant American Navy. But they attacked me, and I had to defend myself. All the same, I was content simply to put the frigate in a condition where it could do me no harm. It won't have any difficulty getting repairs at the nearest port. Ah, Commander, I replied with conviction, your Nautilus is truly a marvelous boat. Ah, yes, Professor, Captain Nemo replied with genuine excitement, and I love it as if it were my own flesh and blood. Aboard a conventional ship pacing the ocean's perils, danger lurks everywhere. On the surface of the sea, your chief sensation is the constant feeling of an underlying chasm, as the Dutchman Jansen so aptly put it. But below the waves aboard the Nautilus, your heart never fails you. There are no structural deformities to worry about because the double hull of this boat has the rigidity of iron, no rigging to be worn out by rolling and pitching on the waves, no sails for the wind to carry off, no boilers for steam to burst open, no fires to fear because this submersible is made of sheet iron, not wood. No coal to run out of, since electricity is its mechanical force. No collisions to fear, because it navigates the watery deep all by itself. No storms to brave, because just a few meters beneath the waves, it finds absolute tranquility. There, sir, there's the ideal ship. And if it's true that the engineer has more confidence in a craft than the builder, and the builder more than the captain himself, you can understand the utter abandon in which I place my trust in the Nautilus, since I'm its captain, builder, and engineer all in one. Captain Nemo spoke with winning eloquence. The fire in his eyes and the passion in his gestures transfigured him. Yes, he loved his ship the same way a father loves his child. But one question, perhaps indiscreet, naturally popped up, and I couldn't resist asking it. You're an engineer, then, Captain Nemo? Yes, Professor, he answered me. I studied in London, Paris, and New York back in the days when I was a resident of the Earth's continents. But how are you able to build this wonderful Nautilus in secret? Each part of it, Professor Aronnax, came from a different spot on the globe and reached me at a cover address. Its keel was forged by Creusot in France, its propeller shaft by Penn and Company in London, the sheet iron plates for its hull by Laird's in Liverpool, its propeller by Scott's in Glasgow, its tanks were manufactured by Cal and Company in Paris, its engine by Krupp in Prussia, its spur by the Motala workshops in Sweden, its precision instruments by Hart Brothers in New York, etc., and each of these suppliers received my specifications under a different name. But, I went on, once these parts were manufactured, didn't they have to be mounted and adjusted? Professor, I set up my workshops on a deserted islet in mid-ocean. There our Nautilus was completed by me and my workmen, in other words, by my gallant companions whom I've molded and educated. Then, when the operation was over, we burned every trace of our stay on that islet, which, if I could have, I'd have blown up. From all this, may I assume that such a boat costs a fortune? An iron ship, Professor Aronnax, wants $1,125 per metric ton. Now then, the Nautilus has a burden of 1,500 metric ton. Consequently, it costs $1,685 million, hence $2 million, including all its accommodation, and $4 or $5 million with all the collections and works of art it contains. One last question, Captain Nemo. Ask, Professor. You're rich, then? Infinitely rich, sir, and without any trouble I could pay off the 10 million franc French national debt. I gaped at the bizarre individual who had just spoken these words. Was he playing on my credulity? Time would tell. And that is where I shall leave you this week. Time will tell, and we will tune in 2 weeks for our next outing into the wonderful world of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, our next meeting will be in 2 weeks. That will be August the 4th, a Thursday at 7 p.m. here on YouTube. In the meantime, go back to our YouTube channel, Washington County Free Library. Check out all of our past episodes of Chapters. Check out all of our OG episodes that were animated. Keep reading. Keep wearing your fabulous hats. I hope you're all wearing your fabulous sea-themed hats, whether they be sea creatures or pirate hats or sailor hats. I'm not picky. Whatever you choose to wear. Keep reading. Keep wearing fabulous hats. Keep dreaming of the sea, and I will see you in 2 weeks' time on August the 4th. It's Thursday, 7 p.m., right here on YouTube. Have a good evening. Bye.